A very good morning to you on this Monday morning, the 12th of May. It is the top of the hour. It's 8 o'clock. I'm Terry Martin. If you've joined us, you are on the fifth connection, where we are moving right along with our very interesting study on what mindfulness is all about. What does it mean to be strategically, intentionally focused and have the mind of Christ saturate our minds, saturate our being? Because across 104 verses, the writer is talking through that. And before we do a quick summary, just a quick word of advertisement. I've had Tom Wadsworth on radio a number of weeks ago, and his work came out about 2 years ago on the whole area of worship and the first century assembly. His recent podcast in a discussion with Dr. Kent Smith has exploded the networks. It has gone viral, 10,000 hits over 5 days. It is said that in the theologies genre, this is absolutely rare, because the discussion has to do with the new way to God, which is what the book of Hebrews is about. We have a freshly slaughtered way, a new and living way into the Holy of Holies. And it's gotten such traction around the world. That's one of the reasons why I had him on radio. He would do well to plug in and listen to that discussion that we had with him. But we continue right along this morning in our discussion of what mindfulness looks like across 4 chapters of the storyline which unfolds across the 104 verses. We saw in our introduction how that in chapter 1, mindfulness is embedded because it takes place inside the context of tribal relationality. Deep relationships in community that form, and that is what inspires the connections around mindfulness. And in the last episode, I tracked for you all the thought words. Describe it as the mind words in chapter 1, and it is chock full of words such as remember, be persuaded, think, know, judge, understand, and the like. And I felt that initially it felt like a bit of a rabbit trail, but it was actually good that we did that, because mindfulness is embedded within a niche of culture. It's embedded in an environment of close relationships. And then in chapter 2 of the unfolding story, mindfulness is embodied. It takes place inside of real live human bodies, because it is about modal cruciformity. The shape of our thinking is shaped after the cross, death and resurrection. To be putting it more specifically, it follows the fractal order of life, death, and resurrection. Order, disorder, and reorder, because that is what ignites cognition. Thinking deeply doesn't just happen in our heads. It happens inside of a human body. And then in chapter 3, the third aspect, mindfulness is exapted. The word exapted means to use something for a purpose other than what it was created for. Mindfulness is something that believers ought to be doing, being deeply thoughtful and spend focused attention on their thinking. It's called metanoia, thinking about thinking. But when we become ideologically locked, we have accepted a function for a purpose other than what it was created for. And ideologies do that. They twist something initially good, but they freeze it in time. And it becomes an echo chamber where we are talking to ourselves. We become avatars of a set of ideas which are set up as an idolatry, and we worship at that system. We worship at the feet of that system. Fatal ideologies, they do not incite hot body on hot body participation within the life of the assembly. They are looking for minds that can be dominated and oppressed by an ideological set of thoughts. It's not about meta thinking. It's not about meta systemic thinking, thinking outside the box. It's rather thinking inside a very restricted box. It doesn't allow for freedom of thinking and freedom of speaking. And then in chapter 4, the writer goes on to talk about the beneficial utility that accrues to those that are given to extended knowing, when they use what they know for the purposes of becoming agentic inside of God's arena. Their agency increases. They are not mentally addicted to a system, because what addiction does, whether it's of the alcoholic variety or the psychedelic variety. It addicts you. It hems you in to think a certain way, to swerve to the Luciferian left hemisphere of the brain, constantly zooming in and fixating and not allowing the big picture, what is called fractal holons. A fractal holon is a part of a whole, but that fractal on its own is a whole. It's part of a bigger whole, WHOLE, and that whole is part of a bigger whole. And that's why story is so significant, because our cognizance or our cognate abilities, our cognizing abilities, our cognition abilities are deeply meshed inside of how stories work, and our brains work according to how stories work, because stories give context. And after all, context is king. Context determines meaning, how ideas and words are used. So that's again a quick overview of the storyline. But let's hone in on verse 3 to verse 11, because that's the paragraph that I'd like to start to unpack this morning. Paul says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making request with joy for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will perform it until the day of Christ. Even as it is meet for me to think of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my bonds and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you are all partakers of my grace. For God is my witness how I long for you all in the tender mercies, or in the bowels of Jesus Christ. Fantastic paragraph that is so loaded with so much, and it's loaded with so many correctives and encouragements for how we need to conduct our lives when we live in the context of community. Because chapter 1 is about that. It's about what living in community is really all about. What does living in community look like? Well, there's cordiality in verse 1 and 2, very respectful greeting and initiating of interactions between people. And then in verse 12 to verse 26, there's continuity inside of community, which ends up in the chapter with caring ultimacy. What does caring for one another ultimately look like? And if we care for God and about God, and we are focused, we are mindful about it, we have these three that will settle into our being: community, continuity, and caring ultimacy. We looked at verse 1 and verse 2, and now from verse 3 to verse 11. We are going to see a very crucial aspect of community life, which is the whole aspect of collaboration. Communities collaborate inside of those communities. There's a working together, because if there's anything that has to do with a community thriving, then it's collaborative endeavor. Working together, not just cooperating towards a goal, but as individuals, but working together now in thinking, doing, and being. And so you're going to see that the text starts out with this idea of thinking, because thinking as collaborative dimensions. Paul says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. How often don't we think about others? They cross our minds. I don't know where that thought came from, but I thought about this and such. I thought about so and so. But for Paul, remembering people and remembering these Philippian believers, it had to do with praying for them. Always in every prayer of mine, remembering them had to do with praying for them and making request for them with joy. How often do you think about others and think about them joyfully, the times that you recall you're engaging with them? It brings a smile to your mind, and a smile puts a smile on your heart, and then finally a smile on your face. Always in every prayer of mine for you all, I'm doing what? Making requests with joy for your fellowship in the gospel. That word fellowship is the word koinonia. The fellowship we have, the joint participation we have with one another in this good news. From the first day until now, from the first time he encountered them, when he engaged them after that almost 16-kilometer trip from Neapolis, northwest, and he encountered them. And now he is writing to them and saying, wow, I remember you, I'm praying for you. The things that I have in mind when I remember you. And so thinking inside of the believing community is crucial. We need to be given to freedom to think. At times, the believing community becomes the last place where you are to put on your thinking cap. It's more this idea, please remove your thinking caps, put your brain in a parking meter, put it into neutral, and now I will tell you what to think. And as preachers, we wax eloquent ad infinitum, in ad nauseum. And then we wonder why people don't get things and get stuff and grab concepts, because we want to think for them. While thinking, learning to think for yourself is important. But of course, according to Ephesians 4 and 1 Corinthians 11 to 14, that's chapter 14, 4 chapters, that endeavor needs to take place in the context of the assembly, in the context of community, where there is cordiality, verse 1 and verse 2. Now there's collaboration, thought collaboration, thinking. I cannot overemphasize this enough because somehow we have been told what to think. Here's a statement of faith. If you believe these 10 things, you are in the in group. And you get a handshake and a little certificate, becomes an indicator that you have jumped through the hoops. So you're part of the in group. And in grouping, listen to this, it's a very powerful thing. None of us want to be left out. That's why we have things like groups of friends. That's why mommies have mothers' meetings. They are little in groupings because they are common. There's a common denominator that knits them together. Thinking, don't forget it. Put your thinking cap on. Not the dunce cap, the thinking cap. Now let's see if we can push this a little further. Text goes on to say, being confident of this very thing. Being confident. That word for confidence comes from the word peitho, which means to persuade. To become confident has to do with what happens in our minds. We become persuaded. You become persuaded as you consider reality, as you consider the flow of reality. Now, that is really crucial. Because again, another thought word. Remember, now be confident. Be confident of what? This very thing. What very thing? That he, who's the antecedent of we, God, in verse 3. He who began a good work in you. When was this good work begun in the Philippian community? And who did it? Well, number one, Paul encountered them 10 years prior to the writing of this letter. And remember how he encounters in Acts 16? Lydia is encountered. And then the second person was a jailbird, a Philippian jailer. So that's when God began the good work. And he started it inside of that community. In you. It's you plural, not you singular. The assembly that started. God began a good work in this community. How did he start it? Well, through Paul. And then also through these Philippian believers, because they were looking for opportunities to serve, opportunities to minister, opportunities to be of service to Paul. And when you read chapter 4 of Philippians, going from 4 all the way to the end of the chapter, you will read how that they were looking for an opportunity, couldn't find one, and eventually they did. And they were able to minister to his needs because he understood that God is the one. My God shall supply, my God will supply all my needs according to his riches in glory. So what was the good work? The good work of ministering to the apostles' needs when he was in dire straits. It says in chapter 4, I have learned that in whatever circumstance I am, therewith to be content. And we will get there in that episode. It says, every circumstance, I learn something. I've learned how to live with much. I've learned how to live with little. But you were part of ministering to my need. The good work that God started in your midst, He will bring it to fruition. He started it in the Philippian context, and it has continued to snowball and will continue to snowball right into the future until the day of Christ, the day when Jesus returns. Now, we use this verse for a very, very different thing. Many use this verse to teach the perseverance of the saints. That's not what is in view. What is in view is their ministration to a needy saint, Paul. Met his need. And that, of course, exploded the work because Philippi was the first European outpost for the gospel in Europe. And it exploded throughout Europe and went to the far corners of the then known world. It was all the way from Spain over to the east, possibly right into the India situation. And so we see that thinking is crucial. Let's end off with verse 7. Even as it is apropos, even as it is meet, M-E-E-T, says the KJV. It is right for me to think this of you all. Again, the third thought word. Remember, be persuaded, and now think. Even as it is right for you to think this, for me to think this of you all. Why do I have you in my thoughts? Because I have you in my heart. So it's not only in my mind, I have you in my heart. And if the heart is the center, the control room of the human being, boy, then that's surely where major decisions are made. Don't let your heart guide you, says Proverbs. Guide your heart and guard your heart. Your heart is to be guided and guarded. So I have you in my thoughts. I have you in my heart. Because thinking is important. In as much as both in my bonds and in what else? In the defense and confirmation of the gospel. So I've got you in my heart in these two spheres because I am in prison and I'm here to defend and confirm the story of the good news that has come to planet Earth. Now we're going to stop right there and not kill this session. We are sitting on 23 minutes already. So we've just looked at thinking, thoughts, because when we look at interacting with one another around collaborating in the gospel and collaborating in our endeavors in the gospel, it has to do with embedded cognition. Mindfulness is not something that is airy-fairy or ethereal. It is about thinking deeply inside of the context of an environment. Our environment as believers is the community of faith, the assembly. That's where our deepest thinking is to be happening. And all of these verbs in 3 to 11 are corporate. Of course, when you think corporately, that includes the individual. You don't think in terms of corporate solidarity as something separate from individuals, but it is together. We engage in thinking, remembering, and we are persuaded. So let's stop right there and on this Monday morning, contemplate the importance of why collaboration has as an important component the idea of thinking together and thinking things through in the context of community. Trust that you'd go with God and have a good Monday. Goodbye for now.